The reason it's a moral disgrace is this. This generation, for the last 50, 60 years, all the modern presidents, you can go all the way back, you can say Woodrow Wilson was exempt, but beyond that, understood there was something unique about the history of slavery and racism in this country, that we had to cure this original sin. It was not cured by the Civil War as Lincoln had hoped, because it was followed by 100 years of state-sponsored oppression. It began to be cured with civil rights, equality of rights, and this generation, the last 50 or so years, has done a splendid job in redeeming itself. What Trump is missing here is the uniqueness of white supremacy, KKK, and Nazism. Yes, there were bad guys on both sides. That's not the point. This was instituted, the riot began over a Nazi riot, a Nazi rally. And the only killing here occurred by one of the pro-Nazi, pro-KKK people.
But if you had people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Friends and enemies, welcome to another episode of Malvo Talks, Season 2. Welcome to the Green Chi Network and all of you who may be listening to me by way of podcast. Today's episode is The Presidents Do Talk Like That. And I got this from the late Charles Krauthammer, who was criticizing Donald Trump about the way he spoke. And it has been a theme that, nobody has ever been as racist as Donald Trump, and so forth and so on, and that he's ruining the dignity of the presidency, and blah, 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 blah. Well, a lot of you don't know your history. The presidents do talk like that, contrary to what Dr. Charles Krauthammer said. The presidents do talk like that, and we're going to take a few presidents, starting, of course, with George Washington, and then we'll go into James Monroe, who said some things that were derogatory in terms of black people. And then we are going to go into Lincoln, who is held up as the greatest of the presidents. And in his Lincoln Douglas, and even after, when he was president, he talked in such a fashion wherein he was clearly not for the equality of the races. But we're going to start with George Washington. And George Washington had a problem because during his tenure as president, one of his wife's house slaves, Oni Judge, absconded, ran away, while the capital was in Philadelphia, and he was on a mission because the way in which he had to oversee the slaves that he brought to Pennsylvania was a very delicate issue. Indeed, in Pennsylvania, if a slave was in the state for over a period of a year, they would automatically be emancipated. And so something had to be worked out where, even though this was also technically against the law, he had to continuously rotate his slaves from service in Philadelphia, and then they had to go back to Mount Vernon after a certain period of time as not to blatantly disregard the law. But nevertheless, Oni Judge took the opportunity when she was in Philadelphia to run away. And Martha Washington was so livid at this. And by the way, it must be pointed out that Martha Washington, as well as George Washington, were intellectually speaking, white supremacists. They were not of the mind that people of African descent were equal to them. And you see, what made this doubly terrible for George himself, at least, was that he had to refund the cost of the person of Odie Judge, what she was worth as a slave, to the Parke Custis estate. So he was fined for this infraction because the slave was lost on his watch. And just like if somebody stole a car or whatever it was, any piece of property, and you're responsible for it, the estate is going to go after you for reimbursement. So he had to reimburse the Parke Custis estate for this missing slave. And here we have, in this book by Henry Winesek, and I will hold it up for the people in the YouTube viewer. Those of you who are in terms of the podcast won't be able to see it, but the name of the book is An Imperfect God, George Washington, His Slaves, and the Creation of America. And here you have the correspondence between him and the person who he had to hire. You had this situation where he had to hire a person to try to coax Odie Judge back into slavery. And he says this is his written letter. Now, he's the President of the United States, George Washington, and he's saying this: enclosed is the name and description of the girl I mentioned to you last night. She has been the particular attendant on Mrs. Washington since she was 10 years old, and was handy and useful to her, being perfect mistress of her needle. I would thank you for writing to the collector of Portsmouth and him for his endeavors to recover and send her back. What will be the best method to effect it? It is difficult for me to say. To seize and put her on board a vessel bound immediately to this place, or to Alexandria, which I should like better. Seems at first view to be the safest and least expensive. But if she is discovered, the collector, well, the slave finder, I am persuaded will pursue such measures as to him shall appear best to effect those ends, and the cost shall be reimbursed, and with thanks besides. I am sorry to give you or anyone else trouble on such a trifling occasion, but the ingratitude of the girl, who was brought up and treated more like a child than a servant, and Mrs. Washington's desire to recover her, ought not to escape with impunity if it can be avoided. In other words, what he is saying is, how dare this woman, this slave of mine, take it upon herself to go and free herself, emancipate herself. How dare she? We treated her nice and kind and everything else like that. See, and even in the standards of the time, because you have to understand, the Somerset case had already been decided, and in Britain, that was the landmark case that, in essence, freed every slave that set foot in Great Britain. So this was nothing in terms of 18th century culture. This was nothing that was an isolated incident. And in terms of Pennsylvania in particularly, Pennsylvania, because of the Quaker situation, and religion, they were already against slavery. So here he is in this environment saying, well, how can a Negro be so ungrateful as to escape, steal herself away from us? And so he had to hire a person to go after her and see if they could get her back. Well, they finally track her down in New England. And I am going to read to you from this book, but one of the letters that he sent to the slave catcher. And I am going to here just read to you this is a letter that he wrote once Odie Judge was tracked down. And he says this: Washington finds the slave. Washington is the slave catcher finds Oni Judge. He's going by Ona now. Ona Judge. And writes back to Washington and says, well, she is of the mind to come back if she is guaranteed her freedom. Now, if she's guaranteed her freedom, she may come back. And so the slave catcher tries to negotiate. It says, well, the Washingtons may be willing, if you come back of your own volition, they may be willing to give you emancipation. And when he starts this negotiation, he writes back to Washington, and George Washington writes him back and says, I regret that the attempt you made to restore the girl, Oni Judge, as she called herself while with us, now she's going by the name Ona, and who, without the least provocation, absconded from her mistress, should have been attended with so little success. To enter into such a compromise with her, meaning to promise her her freedom if she comes back willingly, as she suggested to you, is totally inadmissible for reasons that must strike at first view. For however well disposed I might be to a gradual abolition, or even to an entire emancipation of that description of people, if the latter was in itself practicable at this moment, it would neither be politic or just to reward unfaithfulness with a premature preference, and thereby discontent beforehand the minds of all her fellow servants, who by their steady attachments are far more deserving than herself of favor. In other words, how dare you into negotiation with that nigger? And more importantly, I have other slaves who have been faithful, who deserve to be emancipated, who have not run out on me like Ona Judge. And you tie my hands and you're forcing me into an agreement with a disgruntled and, quite frankly, unfaithful slave. And more to the point, you are in no position to make such a negotiation that I have not authorized you to do. And he goes on. See, now the problem is that the judge is pregnant. Now, this is the author speaking. The president instructed his subordinate to use compulsory means, quote unquote, but to act in secret. I do not mean that such violent measures should be used as would excite a mob or a riot or even uneasy sensations in the minds of the well-disposed citizens. In other words, he is saying to her, see, I don't care if you have to hit her on top of the head and kidnap her back into slavery, but I want that slave back on Mount Vernon by any means necessary without you drawing a crowd, but nevertheless, I want her back, and I don't care what you have to do in order to get her back, even if you have to resort to violent measures. So she's walking, and she has to be grabbed into an alley, hit on top of the head, put on a ship back to Alexandria, but I want her back. And this, you see, is coming from the President of the United States. Here he is, the father of the nation, the founding father, the indispensable man, the one to whom the president was tailored after. Now, you must understand that I completely comprehend the whole form of thinking that George Washington is the man who has a lot of political tact, and he was able to cobble together the various luminaries of his day and get the Republic off on a good foot, politically speaking, and that he was almost like Cincinnatus. He wanted to only be president for a short time and not start a dictatorship. But nevertheless, he does have this opinion that today you would find to be absolutely unreasonable. And indeed, in his day, the various contemporaries, chief among them being people like Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, who used to pester him about, well, when are you going to emancipate the slaves? When are you going to emancipate the slaves? And here he is, instead of just saying, well, look, I'll swallow the cost of Oney George's absconding from me. He's saying, no, kidnap her and bring her back here. And you see, this is very important to understand because these dichotomies help to inform the entire way in which we look at the history of this country. And his overall understanding of black people as a group of people was not so edifying. You see, he said to Arthur Young in a letter that blacks are capable of much labor, but having no ambition to establish a good name, they are too regardless of a bad one. And in that letter to Arthur Young, he was making a comparison to people having free white laborers and black slaves. And here he's making an argument to Arthur Young about the pros and the cons about free labor and black slaves, instead of saying, well, you know, we want to get the nation off to a good start. You might as well, whatever costs you may have in hiring free laborers, take it up for the good of the nation, because slavery is going to become a problem if it is not an intrinsic evil that's separating the very founding constituencies of the republic. See, he's not speaking like that, and here he is, the president. Now, Martha Washington, who was the one that he accused of instigating and getting on his back about when am I going to get back on the judge, she's the one who said once in a letter, the blacks are so bad in their nature that they have not the least gratitude for the kindness that may be showed to them, and that they were born liars. See, Cokie Roberts, who was a journalist and still is a journalist, she's a pundit now more so, and who wrote a book on the founding mothers, you know, she tried to hem, hedge, and haw around the white supremacy of Martha Washington. Martha Washington was a white supremacist, unapologetic about how she felt in terms of the place of white people in comparison to Africans who happened to be slaves. She didn't care, and expressed herself as such. Now, we're going to get to James Monroe, President James Monroe. And the reason why I'm skipping over Thomas Jefferson and things like that is because Thomas Jefferson said so many racist things in his tenure that, you know, it would take up most of his video. And I want to get to some important points just briefly, so that you can see, you know, Donald Trump is not disgracing the office of president at all. Here, speaking to John Quincy Adams, who would succeed him as president, here he is saying that he's talking about the free blacks who lived in Virginia at that time. And here he is being quoted by John Quincy Adams. And he is saying here that the president, this is James Monroe, said this subject had been recommended by a resolution of the Virginia legislature. He was talking about the colonization of free blacks, in other words, a repatriation back to Africa. And he's saying, and then he enlarged upon the great earnestness there was in Virginia for the gradual abolition of slavery upon the excellent and happy condition of the slaves in that state. Now you see the problem with that. Upon the kindness with which they were treated and the mutual attachment subsisting between them and their masters, he said that the feeling against slavery was so strong that shortly after the close of our revolution, many persons had voluntarily emancipated their slaves. But this had introduced a class of very dangerous people, the free blacks, who lived by pilfering and corrupted the slaves and produced such pernicious consequences that the legislature was obliged to prohibit further emancipation by law. The important object now was to remove these free blacks and provide a place to which the emancipated slaves might go. The legal obstacles to emancipation might then be withdrawn, and the black population in time be drawn off entirely from Virginia. So, in other words, what he's saying is, you see, out of the slave state, black people are thieves and troublemakers. And furthermore, what he is saying is that, oh, well, you see the black slaves in slavery, you know, they love their masters, and look at how benevolent they are. They wanted to gradually emancipate them, which is not true in terms of the history. As a matter of fact, the people of Virginia made it very hard for the slave owners to emancipate their slaves. And this is one of the reasons why people did not follow George Washington's example of emancipating or manumitting their slaves after their death. Indeed, James Monroe would not emancipate his slaves en masse at all. Neither did James Madison. Neither did Thomas Jefferson. And you see, what he is saying here is that if it wasn't for those terrible free blacks who frustrated the movement to emancipation, we would have had more of a consensus to emancipate or sign on to a gradual manumission, just like the states in the North. And therefore, this is what is frustrating. He's saying this to John Quincy Adams. This is what's frustrating the whole principle. But you see the idea of African Americans out of the slave state being synonymous with the behavior of criminality. And that's how the white slave owners justified holding on to their slaves for so long. And now we are going to go into Abraham Lincoln. And I just want to point out a couple of things, because here this president was, in terms of bequeathed by destiny, to be the great emancipator and sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which have gone down in history as being a mark of great virtue on the part of Lincoln, where Lincoln said famously, "A house divided amongst itself cannot stand," and all the rest of that. Well, you know, he said a lot of other things in those debates, and I'm going to read to you some of the things that were completely unacceptable, I guess you could say, racially speaking. But nevertheless, you know, you must understand that all the presidents up until Barack Obama have been racist in some form or fashion, both in the 17th century terminology and understanding of the word, as well as in the 20th century understanding of the word. And I am going to read to you from one of the speeches. And here he is saying, in terms of what his beliefs in the viability of black equality is, even after the whole slave debate. Because it must be understood that in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln is not arguing for a general emancipation. What he's saying is, if we just contain slavery to the southern states that already have slaves, and with the new states that want to join the Republic, we should not, under any circumstances, make any of this new territory slave-holding territory. But in terms of his views about African Americans and where they stand in comparison to white people, what he says is this: While I had not proposed to myself on this occasion to say much on that subject, yet as the question was asked me, I thought I would occupy perhaps 5 minutes in saying something in regard to it. He's speaking in terms of what he thinks about black people, black equality, and black people having the right to the suffrage. He says, I will say then that I am not nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. And here, in captions, the crowd is applauding this. And he says that I am not nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. I say upon this occasion, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. I do not understand that because I do not want a Negro woman or for a slave. I must necessarily want her for a wife. Cheers and laughter, again in captions. My understanding is that I can just let her alone. That I have never had the least apprehension that I or my friends would marry Negroes if there was no law to keep them from it. But as Judge Douglas, now he's talking about Stephen Douglas, and his friends seem to be in great apprehension that they might, if there were no law to keep them from it, I give him the most solemn pledge that I will be to the very last stand by the law of this state, which forbids the marrying of white people with Negroes. I will add one further word, which is this, that I do not understand there is any place where an alteration of the social and political relations of the Negro and the white man can be made except in the state legislature, not in the Congress of the United States. And as I do not really apprehend the approach of any such thing myself, and as Judge Douglas seems to be in constant horror, the same such danger is rapidly approaching, I propose as the best means to prevent it that the judge be kept at home and placed in the state legislature to fight the measure. In other words, he needs to stay in the state legislature, not go to the Senate, and uphold the rights of white people against black people. But you see how the presidents argue. Later when Abraham Lincoln does become president, he says, I'll hold the Union together any way I can. Slavery or any other way. But I can hold the Union together. And even after he does give the abolition, it is only in the rebel territory. He needs a constitutional amendment to release the slaves. But even in those states that were slaveholding and remained in the Union, you must understand that Lincoln did gradually bring about the emancipation through reparation, not to the slave, but to the slave master. In other words, the state paid the loss of equity, whatever was deemed the value of the slave, to the white slave master so that the slaves could be emancipated. But you see the sociology inherent in this discussion, which is that, even unto today, these presidents seem to rise above the present conditions and present moral attitudes. No, they do not. Lincoln was, until the day he died, a believer in some form of white supremacy. Yes, he was kind to Frederick Douglass, and, yes, he emancipated the slaves, but you see, he was not of the mind that all black people, he later gave way and said that veterans, black people who had fought in the Civil War, the Negro Union soldiers, they should be the only ones that had access to the vote or maybe to political office. But I am convinced had Lincoln lived, you would never have had the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gave black suffrage universally and the right to hold political office. So that you can see in that debate, that speech from the Lincoln-Douglas debate, you see Lincoln was not beyond his time. And, in terms of everybody jumping up and down with Donald Trump and his rhetoric, you gotta understand all of that in the context. You see, unfortunately, we are living in a world where people don't really know their history, and they don't read, and they sometimes deceive people into thinking that, presidents had this transcendent view of things, and that's what got them elected. No, that is not the case. That's media gibberish. But anyway, I just hope that you understand that presidents are capable of saying very hateful things, and that's the point of this episode. Now, I want you to comment, I want you to like the video, and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to put some of those Washingtons and Lincolns into my PayPal account. And that is paypal.me/ETHAN905. Again, that's paypal.me/ETHAN905. And I just want you to understand that not unlike PBS, this is a service. And so I need your contributions in order to illustrate that there is interest not only in this show, but in the topics that are addressed here. And I want you to understand the framework of the show. This last episode that you see is really a bridge to the last two episodes in this season of Malvo Talks, which are going to close out the second season. And it's a bridge to understanding why we are in a crisis in this society and the understanding of our actual history and how that can inform how we are handling the present issues and what are the problems that have not been resolved by our democracy. So I want you to, again, put some money into that PayPal account, but also comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. There is a lot of things that are not being addressed by the cable news channels and other outlets. And I want this to be a place for all of you who have questions about the history of this country, where we are going, and what are the actual American values. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you in the next episode.